The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it accused. It came down in relentless, icy sheets that turned the city into a blurred watercolor painting of steel and sorrow. To the guests inside the Harrington Gala, safe behind triple-pane glass and sipping vintage champagne, the storm was merely ambience, a dramatic backdrop for their display of wealth. But for Scarlett, standing on the other side of the velvet ropes, the rain was a physical assault. She huddled under the narrow awning of the service entrance, her cheap trench coat soaked through to the lining. Scarlett was 25, but tonight she felt 100 years old. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, clutched a crumpled manila envelope against her chest as if it contained the last beat of her heart. It was a foreclosure notice, the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence that had been her life for the past year. She wasn't a guest of the gala. She was the invisible ghost who had just been fired from the catering staff for dropping a tray of hors d'oeuvres when her trembling hands finally gave out. Invisibility is a heavy cloak to wear when you're drowning. She shouldn't have been crying. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, a waste of energy she needed just to walk the 10 blocks to the bus stop. But the exhaustion was a tide she could no longer hold back. She leaned her head against the rough brick wall, letting the hot tears mix with the freezing rain on her cheeks, closing her eyes against the glare of the flashbulbs popping near the main entrance. She was playing a melody in her head, a sad, solitary tune on a cello, trying to drown out the noise of her own despair. She didn't hear the heavy, purring engine of the black limousine that glided to a stop just a few feet away. She didn't hear the murmur of the valet or the authoritative click of the car door opening. She only heard the silence that suddenly fell over the immediate area, a vacuum of sound that commanded attention. Richard Harrington stepped out of the car. He was the owner of the Skyline, a man whose last name was carved into the granite of half the buildings in the financial district. Tall, with a tailored black coat that seemed to repel the elements, he moved with the weary grace of a predator who had forgotten the thrill of the hunt. At 34, Richard had the world at his feet and absolutely nothing in his hands that mattered. He was leaving his own party early, bored by the sycophants and the hollow laughter. He adjusted his cufflinks, ready to dive into the sanctuary of his vehicle when he saw her. It wasn't that she was beautiful, though she was, in a tragic, ethereal way. It was the way she stood. She was completely still amidst the chaos of a storm, a statue of grief carved out of shadows. While everyone else was looking at him, desperate for his attention, his money, his favor, she was looking at nothing. She was a void in his universe of constant demands. Richard stopped. The valet held an umbrella over him, confused by the delay. Richard ignored him. He looked at the woman, shivering in the service doorway, clutching that wet envelope. He felt a strange, sharp pull in his chest, a resonance he hadn't felt in years. It was the recognition of a shared frequency. The rain does not ask for permission to fall, just as the heart does not ask for permission to break. He walked away from the safety of the umbrella. The rain hit his expensive coat, spotting the wool, but he didn't flinch. He walked until he was standing right in front of her, invading the sanctuary of her misery. Scarlett sensed the presence and opened her eyes. She gasped, shrinking back against the brick. She knew who he was. Everyone knew Richard Harrington. He was the king of the castle she had just been kicked out of. She expected him to tell her to move, to stop loitering, to be less visible. "You're ruining the paper," Richard said. His voice was deep, devoid of the mockery she expected. He gestured to the sodden envelope in her hands. Scarlett looked down, then back up at him, her hazel eyes wide and unguarded. "It's already ruined," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Everything is." Richard looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the abyss. He saw the end of the rope she was holding. And for the first time in a decade, the ice around his heart cracked. He didn't offer her money. He didn't call security. "Get in the car," Richard commanded softly. It wasn't a request. I can't, Scarlett stammered, terrified. I'm wet. I'm nobody. You are freezing, Richard corrected her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to hold the car door open himself, a gesture that shocked the watching staff. And tonight, nobody should be left in the rain. Not even you. He waited. The air between them crackled with a sudden, terrifying voltage. Scarlett looked at the open door, a portal to a world she didn't belong in, and then at the cold, dark street awaiting her. She made a choice that defied all logic. She stepped forward, leaving the shadows, and allowed the billionaire to usher her into the warmth. As the door clicked shut, sealing them in together, Scarlett realized she hadn't just entered a car. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The interior of the limousine was a sanctuary of hushed leather and amber lighting, a stark, jarring contrast to the violent world Scarlett had just left. The silence here wasn't empty, it was expensive. It smelled of cedarwood and aged scotch, a scent that made her dizzy with its richness. Scarlett sat on the edge of the plush seat, dripping water onto the pristine floor mats, clutching her knees as if trying to make herself occupy less space in Richard Harrington's orbit. Richard sat across from her, pouring a crystal glass of brandy. He watched her not with the predatory gaze of men who offered rides to women in the rain, but with the analytical curiosity of a collector who had found something rare broken on the pavement. He extended the glass. "Drink," he said softly. "It will stop the shaking." Scarlett took the glass, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. His skin was warm, dry and steady. Hers was ice-cold and trembling. The contact sent a jolt through the car that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was the friction of two tectonic plates colliding, the man who owned the city and the woman the city was trying to erase. She took a sip, the liquid burning a path down her throat, warming the hollow ache in her chest. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you stop?" Richard looked out the tinted window at the blurring lights of Seattle. "Because I was bored of perfection," he murmured, turning back to her with an intensity that stole her breath. "And you, my dear, are beautifully, tragically real. We are often most drawn to the wreckage that mirrors our own internal ruin." The car didn't take her to a bus station. It glided into the private underground garage of the Harrington Tower, a fortress of steel and glass that pierced the night sky. Scarlett didn't protest. She was too exhausted to fight the current of fate. When the elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse, she stepped out onto Italian marble, her wet sneakers making a squeaking sound that echoed her unworthiness in this cathedral of wealth. The penthouse was vast, cold, and impeccably designed, a museum where no one actually lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, the millions of lights looking like scattered diamonds. Scarlett walked toward the glass, mesmerized. From down below, the city was a prison of debt and failure. From up here, it was just a painting. "It looks so peaceful," she whispered, her reflection ghosting against the glass. "It's a lie," Richard said, standing just behind her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the rain that had dampened his coat. "From this height, you can't hear the screams. You can't see the dirt. It's just distance." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, a hesitation that spoke volumes. He wanted to touch her, to ground himself in her reality, but the chasm between them was filled with invisible barbed wire. She was a caterer with a foreclosure notice. He was the billionaire who likely employed the people who fired her. "I should go," Scarlett said, panic suddenly rising as the intimacy of the moment became too heavy. She turned, clutching the wet manila envelope she had placed on a side table. "Stay," Richard commanded, the words softer this time, almost a plea. "The storm is getting worse. There is a guest suite. You are safe here." He walked over to the table and picked up the envelope she had been guarding with her life. It was sodden, the paper peeling away. Before Scarlett could stop him, he flipped it over. The room seemed to lose all its oxygen. Richard stared at the document. It wasn't just a foreclosure notice. At the top of the page, stamped in aggressive red ink, was the logo of the creditor seizing her family's small home, Harrington Capital Trust. His own company. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The irony was cruel and absolute. He had saved her from the rain, but he was the one who had conjured the storm. He looked from the damning paper to Scarlett, who stood trembling by the window, unaware that her savior was also her executioner. The tension in the room shifted from romantic possibility to a razor-sharp edge of guilt and impending betrayal. He held the evidence of his own ruthlessness in his hands, and for the first time in his life, Richard Harrington felt the crushing weight of his own name. He couldn't tell her. Not tonight. But the secret now burned in his pocket, a silent ticking bomb waiting to destroy the fragile bridge they had just begun to build. Daylight has a cruel way of stripping away the romance of a storm. The morning sun that flooded Richard's penthouse was not warm, it was clinical, exposing every speck of dust and every lie hidden in the shadows of the night before. Scarlett woke in the guest suite, surrounded by sheets that cost more than her childhood home. For a few disorienting seconds, she felt safe. The smell of brewing coffee drifted down the hall, a domestic siren song luring her into a false sense of belonging. She walked out into the vast living area, wearing the oversized cashmere robe Richard had left for her. She felt small, an intruder in a palace of glass. She found Richard in his study, the heavy oak doors slightly ajar. He wasn't the savior of the previous night, holding an umbrella against the rain. He was Richard Harrington, the CEO, standing behind a massive desk, barking orders into a phone. "I have the file right here," Richard said, his voice sharp, devoid of the gentleness she had tasted. "The debt is substantial. We need to resolve the asset immediately." Scarlett froze. The words debt and asset were trigger wires in her mind. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the floor. She watched as Richard picked up the crumpled, water-stained manila envelope, her envelope, and placed it next to a pristine, legal document bearing the metallic crest of Harrington Capital Trust. The connection snapped into place with the violence of a bone breaking. She hadn't just been saved by a rich stranger. She had been rescued by the architect of her ruin. The man who had offered her shelter was the same man whose signature was likely on the eviction notice that had left her crying in the rain. Trust is a fragile vase. Once cracked, it can never hold water again. Richard hung up the phone and turned, sensing her presence. When he saw her standing in the doorway, pale and trembling, the color drained from his face. He looked guilty. Not just surprised, but deeply, irrevocably guilty. "Scarlett," he started, stepping around the desk, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I was just trying to." "You own it," she whispered, her voice shaking. She pointed a trembling finger at the document on his desk. "Harrington Capital. That's you. You are the bank." "It's a subsidiary," Richard pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. "I didn't know until last night. I swear to you, Scarlett, when I opened that envelope, I realized who you were. And you didn't tell me." Scarlett's voice rose, cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "I sat here, drinking your brandy, looking at your view, pouring my heart out about losing my home, and you sat there knowing you were the one taking it." "I was trying to fix it," Richard argued, reaching for her, but she flinched away as if his touch were a brand. "I was on the phone with legal. I was going to erase the debt." "Erase it!" Scarlett let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded like glass shattering. "Like a stain? Like a mistake? Is that what I am to you, Richard? A little clerical error you can fix with a phone call to make yourself feel like a hero?" The tragedy wasn't that he owned the bank. The tragedy was the power dynamic. In that moment, the magic of the previous night, the connection of two souls finding each other in the rain, dissolved into a sordid reality. He was the master, She was the beggar. His silence had turned his kindness into a manipulation. She felt naked, exposed, and foolish for believing that a man in a penthouse could ever truly understand the woman on the street. "You hired me to cater your party," she said, tears hot and stinging in her eyes. "Your company fired me. Your bank is taking my house. And now you think a night in a guest room makes us even." "It wasn't about that," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I saw you. I just wanted to help." "You didn't help," Scarlett said, backing away toward the elevator, clutching the rope tight around her as if it were armor. "You just wanted to see what it felt like to hold the thing you were crushing." She didn't wait for his defense. She turned and ran. The elevator doors slid shut, severing the connection, leaving Richard standing alone in his tower of gold. He held the phone in one hand and her crumpled envelope in the other, realizing too late that in trying to save her financial life in secret, he had bankrupted the only emotional truth he had found in years. The separation was absolute, leaving a silence far louder and far lonelier than the storm. 3 days passed in a silence that felt heavier than the storm. Scarlett was back in her small, crumbling home, surrounded by the cardboard skeletons of her life. The boxes were packed, taped, and stacked against the peeling wallpaper. Every object she placed inside, a chipped mug, a photo of her parents, her worn apron, felt like a piece of herself she was burying. The foreclosure was no longer just a legal threat. It was a physical reality closing in on her, fueled by the very man she had foolishly allowed herself to trust for one rainy night. She was taping the final box when a knock echoed through the empty hallway. It wasn't the aggressive pound of a sheriff serving papers. It was hesitant, human. Scarlett opened the door to find Richard standing on her rotting porch. He wasn't wearing the armor of his black trench coat. He wore a simple gray sweater, and his hair was windblown, stripping him of the untouchable aura of the penthouse. He looked tired. He looked mortal. In his hand, he held a thick envelope, but this one wasn't sodden with rain. "Did you come to evict me yourself?" Scarlett asked, her voice sharp to hide the tremor of her heart. "Or did you just want to see the asset one last time?" "I came to resign," Richard said quietly. Scarlett frowned, her hand freezing on the doorframe. Resign? From what? From being the man who didn't know the cost of his own profit. He stepped forward, not pushing his way in, but waiting for her to step back. Scarlett hesitated, then retreated, allowing the architect of her ruin into the wreckage of her home. Richard looked around at the boxes, at the dismantling of her life, and a look of profound pain crossed his face. He placed the envelope on a stack of books. "I didn't tell you the truth that morning because I was ashamed," Richard confessed, his voice raw. "Not because I own the bank, Scarlett, but because when I looked at your file, I realized that my company had targeted this neighborhood specifically. We bought the debt to bulldoze these homes for a high-rise." Scarlett felt the air leave her lungs. "You were going to destroy everything." "I was," Richard admitted, unflinching. "Until I met you. Until I saw the woman fighting for a life I was treating as a line item on a spreadsheet." He pointed to the envelope. "Inside that is the deed to this house. It is fully paid. The foreclosure is canceled. But it wasn't a clerical fix, Scarlett. I had to personally buy the debt from the board. It caused a panic. My partners are calling for a vote of no confidence. They say I'm letting emotion dictate business." Scarlett stared at the envelope. He hadn't just written a check. He had gone to war for her. He had risked his standing, his reputation, and his control over his own empire to save one small, insignificant house in a neighborhood he was supposed to level. We often burn down the world to keep one person warm. "Why?" Scarlett whispered, looking up at him, her eyes searching for the trap. "Why would you risk your company for a caterer you met in the rain?" "Because you were right," Richard said, stepping closer, the distance between them closing. "I stood in my penthouse, looking at the city, and I realized I was homeless. I have 10 properties and no home, Scarlett. You stood in the rain fighting for this place because it holds your history, your love, your pain. You have something I haven't felt in 20 years. He reached out, and this time she didn't flinch. He took her hand, her rough, working-class hand, in his. I didn't do this to buy your forgiveness, Richard murmured, his thumb brushing her skin. I did it because saving this house was the first time in my life I used my money to build something real instead of just tall. The anger that had fueled Scarlett's packing began to dissolve, replaced by a terrifying hope. He wasn't the enemy. He was a man waking up from a long, cold sleep. The choice was now hers. She could hold on to her pride, reject his gesture, and walk away with her boxes. Or she could accept that sometimes the person who breaks you is the only one who knows how to put the pieces back together. She looked at the deed, then at Richard. The man who had found her crying in the rain was now standing in her living room, waiting for her verdict. I can't pay you back, Scarlett said softly, her voice trembling. You already have, Richard replied, his eyes locking onto hers with intense vulnerability. You woke me up. Scarlett didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she tightened her grip. It wasn't a full embrace, not yet, but it was a start. The boxes were still packed, the future was still uncertain, but as the afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows, the line between the billionaire and the outcast blurred. They were just two people standing in the ruins, deciding that perhaps they didn't have to rebuild alone. The reconciliation had begun, fragile as glass, but real enough to hold the weight of their impossible connection. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the crumbling living room did not bring a magical erasure of their differences. Life, unlike a fairy tale, does not simply smooth over the edges of a jagged reality. The boxes were unpacked, yes, but the scars on the walls of Scarlett's home remained, visible reminders of how close she had come to losing everything. Richard Harrington did not escape unscathed either. The vote of no confidence he had spoken of became a brutal, public war within the glass walls of Harrington Capital. He survived, but he emerged with a different kind of power, lighter, less absolute, and infinitely more human. He canceled the high-rise project, a decision that cost him millions and earned him the disdain of his peers, but gave him back the ability to sleep without the aid of scotch and silence. It was a Tuesday evening, a month later, when the rain returned to Seattle. It wasn't the violent, accusatory storm of the night they met. It was a gentle, rhythmic washing of the world. Scarlett stood on her porch, wrapped in a thick cardigan, watching the droplets cling to the railing. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by a pot of hardy winter hydrangeas Richard had awkwardly brought her a week ago. A car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't the limousine. It was a sleek, understated sedan. Richard stepped out, carrying no umbrella, allowing the mist to settle on his coat. He walked up the cracked path that he had once planned to bulldoze, his steps firm and familiar. You're getting wet, Scarlett called out, a soft smile touching her lips. I'm learning to like it, Richard replied, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her, and the distance between them, once measured in tax brackets and elevator floors, felt non-existent. He joined her on the porch, leaning against the railing. He didn't try to usher her into a car or whisk her away to a penthouse. He simply stood in her world. The board settled today, Richard said quietly, looking out at the glistening street. I kept the chair, but I sold off the predatory debt division. We're restructuring, focusing on community development rather than displacement. That sounds expensive, Scarlett noted, moving closer to him. It cost me a fortune, Richard admitted, turning to look at her, his dark eyes warm and clear. But it was the only way to make the name on the building match the man standing here. I couldn't be the man who saved you and the man who destroyed your neighbors at the same time. Scarlett reached out and took his hand. It was no longer the hand of a stranger or a savior, it was the hand of a partner. You didn't save me, Richard, she whispered. You just stopped the bleeding. We saved each other." They stood in the quiet hum of the rain, the sound wrapping around them like a curtain. It was a moment of profound, simple peace, the kind that cannot be bought, only built. Richard looked at the small, weathered house behind her, then at the woman who defended it with her life. He realized that for all his skyscrapers, he had never understood the concept of a foundation until now. The rain does not ask for permission to fall, just as the heart does not ask for permission to break. The leitmotif echoed in his mind one last time, but the meaning had shifted. The heart didn't ask permission to break, but it also didn't ask permission to heal. It simply did, resilient and stubborn, finding life in the cracks of the ruin. "I used to hate the rain," Scarlett confessed, resting her head on his shoulder. "It always felt like the world was crying." "And now?" Richard asked, wrapping his arm around her, shielding her from the damp wind. "Now," she murmured, listening to his heartbeat, steady and real against her ear. "Now it sounds like music. It sounds like the night everything changed." Their love was still a forbidden thing in the eyes of a social circle, a billionaire and a caterer, a king and a rebel. There would be whispers, there would be cameras, but as Richard kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of rain and resilience, he knew he no longer cared about the view from the penthouse. The air up there was thin and cold. Down here, amidst the struggle and the truth, the air was thick with life. Richard Harrington had spent his life building towers to touch the sky, but he had finally found his heaven on a rotting porch in the rain. "I'm not going back to the tower tonight," Richard said softly. "Good," Scarlett replied, tightening her grip on his hand. "Because the roof here leaks, and I might need someone to hold the bucket." He laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that mingled with the patter of the rain. In the end, the story wasn't about the money he gave or the debt he erased. It was about the moment he stepped out of his car and chose to get wet. It was about the courage to leave the safety of the glass and stand in the storm. He found her crying in the rain, thinking she was the one who needed saving, only to realize she was the water that would finally wash his soul clean.